Today, we're going to be talking about intelligence, focusing on testing and individual differences. So standardization. So people that take tests are compared against the sample group, which is the standardization group. A lot of you guys are very familiar with it. In the society we live in today, most of you guys have taken numerous standardized tests. And one of the things they do with this is to try to see where you fall in within the group. Something we talked about earlier in the year was standard deviation. So if you look at this curve here, this is a normal curve. This is, uh, you see standard deviation here. So each line here is one standard deviation, right? So we're going to focus on IQ. So the average IQ is 100, right? Something you should probably know. And we're going to go into the formula of how um, you get that later in the notes. But pretty much you take your mental age, and that's whatever the test says you are, divided by your chronological age, how many years you've been alive, and multiply it by 100, right? So theoretically, if you're 10 years old, you score as the average 10-year-old, that's 10 divided by 10 is 1 times 100, the average IQ is 100. So the average range is 85 to 115. So if your IQ is between 85 and 115, you are average. That is one standard deviation, right? That's what ST stands for right there. If you remember, we talked about that earlier in the year, like the different percentages. So you see how you got 34%, 34%. So everything falls. So standard deviation, one standard deviation is 68% of all the data, right? Then if you go to two standard deviations, right, the next one there, now, that's another 27%. So you're talking about most of the people there. I believe that was around 95%. And, within three standard deviations, you're talking about almost everyone, right? You're talking about like 99% of the people. And we'll break down the different IQs in a little bit. But pretty much you have the average IQ is one standard deviation. If you're in the next 15, so every 15 is the standard deviation, right? So if you're in the next 15, over here, now that's called above average intelligence. Anything above 130, you're considered gifted. And then, the 15 below is below average intelligence. Anything below that is we consider a learning disability, which once again we'll go into a little bit more detail later. The Flynn effect. Uh, this is a very interesting theory, and I'll post a TED talk with Flynn who discusses it. But what this is, the Flynn effect is a substantial increase in the average IQ scores on intelligence tests all over the world as years went on. So the standardization needed to occur for the current generations, therefore cannot accurately compare to the past generations. In the video, it's Flynn himself talking. He does a great job of giving different examples of why we can't compare test scores. So you always have to compare it. So when you do a standardized test, you're comparing it to everyone who's taking that test. You're not comparing it to everyone who took it 30, 40, 50 years ago, because it wouldn't be fair to do that, because theoretically, we should be getting smarter. The IQ scores would be going up, where now, most people would be scoring at the genius level compared to 100 years ago. Are we that much smarter now than we were before? No, it's just we have the different technologies and things like that allow us to score better. So it doesn't mean that we're necessarily smarter, or compared back then, most people would have an intellectual disability. Did most people have an intellectual disability 100 years ago? No. That's why you can't compare their scores to our scores, and that's what the Flynn effect is saying. And he gives a bunch of examples in the video, one of which, like, if you're comparing, like, if someone comes down and is looking at targets of a gun, and you compare the rifles that they used in the Civil War compared to the rifles we have now, there's can be a big difference of how many bullets you can shoot and stuff like that. So it's not fair to compare both, right? It's the whole apples and oranges type of thing. But interesting, I've read an article recently that says the opposite is happening, right? Standardized test scores are actually going in the wrong direction now. So think about that. Why do you think maybe that's happening? Why are IQ scores getting less nowadays? So is there something going on in our culture now why they would be going down instead of up like they have been? So how do we measure individual differences? Psychology relies heavily on testing individuals. It is part of the foundation for psychological analysis. To be effective, however, strict guidelines must be followed. So here's some vocab to know. One is validity. So just know the overall what validity means, right? So does the test actually measure what we say it does, right? What we want it to measure. So whenever you're doing a test, and I've heard this in numerous like master classes and things like that, you're always looking for reliability and validity. So does it actually measure what we want? If you're taking a math test, but yet it's measuring how well you can read, that's not a very valid test. That's not a valid math test. So it doesn't actually measure what we want it to measure. So if it's an IQ test, does it actually measure how smart you are? Face validity. Does the test look like it tests what it is supposed to test? So face validity is, does it look like it's a correct test? Content validity, each part of the test is representative of the larger body of knowledge. All right, so, the different parts of it, does it represent, what we're learning? So think about like psychology. Is this, particular quiz or test, is it measuring what it's supposed to in the whole of the psychology class? You also have criterion validity. This is the behavior, such as a college grades, that a test such as the SAT is designed to predict. All right, so you take the SAT or ACT or whatever it might be because it's supposed to predict how well you do in college. So that's criterion validity. Do the two match up? You have predictive validity, the success with which a test predicts the behavior it is designed to predict. And so you can kind of see the diagram down there. Criterion validity, do the responses agree with the gold standard? Construct validity, are the responses similar to what you would expect given other data? And then face validity, does this question mean the same thing to you as it does in the study? And we're going to see that with some biases with tests as well, because the same thing might mean two different things to two different people. And if that's the case, then you're not getting an accurate score. So definition. So what is the definition of intelligence, right? That's what these notes are. So it's the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use knowledge to adapt to new experiences. So the key word here is the ability, right? The ability to learn. So intelligence isn't how much you know, because maybe you just weren't exposed to the information that someone else was. So that's not necessarily fair to say, oh, you're more intelligent than them. You were just exposed more. So the key thing about intelligence, it's the ability to learn. And so, we're going to be talking a lot about intelligence tests. And intelligence tests are a method used to assess an individual's mental aptitudes and compare those to others. Right? So it's, once again, it's your ability to be able to learn aptitudes. So assessing intelligence, right? So here's just a little diagram. So as the range of data under the consideration narrows, its predictive powers diminishes. So it's saying you want to look at a lot of data. So the greater correlation over a broad range. So if you look at all this, this is like football lineman success with body weight in pounds. So as you can tell, right, the more you weigh, typically the more success you tend to have. But what this is saying, if you just look at a narrow part of the data, so this is the whole data. If you look at all the data, you can see, you can see an increase with weight and success. Well, if you just look at a little bit of the data right here, and you just look at these dots, remember when we did like the scatter plots earlier in the year, there's no correlation there. It all kind of looks the same. So once you get to a certain point, the success isn't that much more. So this is just saying you have to look at all the data, not just a narrow range of it. So measuring individual differences. The second part of a credible test is reliability, right? So I said, you always want to make sure it's valid and reliable. So reliability, a test yields the same results over time. And so, what makes it reliable is consistency. Maybe you get lucky one time, not lucky another time, or every year you're getting consistent results. Like think about like the SAT or ACT, things like that. Because if the tests are all over the place, that's not something that you want to be using. You want it to be consistent. So here's some examples if you look at the targets here. So the first one right here, right? So you have, uh, you see the target, so this one, you have all the arrows are very similar, but they're not hitting the target. So this is reliable. You're getting consistent results, but it's not valid. You're not testing what you want to test. The one in the middle, the arrows are all over the place. This isn't reliable, and it's not valid. The one, on the right here, this is reliable and valid. You get consistent results, and you're hitting the target. So creating validity and reliability. The most efficient way to create validity and reliability is to use a standardized test. That's why we use it. We might not like it, and we probably use it too often compared to some other countries. Like I think it's Finland who has, I think, the #1 education system. I think they give one standardized test when they're 16, something like that. So we probably use it too often. But, it is an efficient tool, to see, if you're learning what you're supposed to. So in the most basic sense, a standardized test means a couple things, right? The administration and scoring is the same for each test. The results of the test can be used to draw a conclusion about the test takers in regards to the objectives of the test, right? Like maybe the AP test, right? You guys will be taking the AP test in May. It's going to show, did you learn, enough stuff to get credit, to get college credit for this class, which hopefully most of you guys will. The SAT, ACT, same types of things like we talked about before. Are you prepared for college? Intelligence testing, right? A term that is used frequently but often misunderstood is intelligence. So what exactly is intelligence? Many people disagree about what exactly intelligence is, but most do agree that it is relative, right? Defined in relation to the same abilities in the comparison group, usually age. So intelligence is relative. So, it's not fair to compare like a 5-year-old to a 10-year-old, right? Obviously the 10-year-old should, know more. One, their brain's more developed. They've been exposed to more things, right? And if you remember, like we talked about cognitive stages of development with Piaget, so, your brain develops a certain way. So not until you're 12 are you really doing that critical thinking. And then hypothetically constructed, right? It is unobservable, but instead inferred from behavior. So you might be really intelligent, but you just don't show it. Testing IQ. IQ, which is intelligence quotient, became a popular way to classify people in the early 1900s when two French psychologists, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon, developed a test to identify those students who were gifted and those who needed a little extra help. Right? So the original development of the IQ test wasn't to label people, and that's what it's become now. Right? We seem to love to label people nowadays. That's not what it was meant for. It was to see, what students were a little bit gifted and which students need a little bit extra help. Because back then you had a lot of different abilities in the same classes. It's not the same education system it is now. So they developed something called the Binet-Simon test. The test had 4 important distinctions. One, scores were interpreted at their current performance, used to identify students in need of help, not label them or categorize them, emphasized that training and opportunity could affect intelligence, and was empirically constructed. Right? And so, this is the first main kind of standardized test that we had, and it's very important. And I always like to point out that it's to help students, not to label them, and we've kind of gone away from that a little bit. And they would do it depending on your training and kind of like what you're exposed to could affect that. So scoring the test was done by calculating the mental age, which you'll see MA a lot in the notes, and the chronological age, CA. In 1912, a German psychologist, William Stern, actually came up with this idea. So Binet-Simon kind of came up with the test, but it was actually William Stern who kind of came up with this whole IQ and how to figure it out. All right, so MA is the average age at which the normal individual achieves a particular score. So, what's the average 10-year-old score? So I know I was recently looking at some of my test scores from when I was in junior high and stuff like that, and it would say, oh, you're at this level. This is the average score for a 9th grader in the 6th month type of thing. So that's the mental age. And then the chronological age is, the number of years since you've been born. So coming to America, The idea of IQ testing became popular in America for three reasons. There's a huge increase in immigration, so they wanted to see the abilities of everyone coming in. New laws requiring universal education. So before this, if you learned in U.S. history class last year or maybe this year, you learned about child labor and child labor laws. Well, a lot of times children had to work to support their families. Well, that wasn't allowed anymore. Now you have these laws where kids had to go to school. So now you have this influx of students in education. So they needed a way to measure their abilities. And the next one was military assessing new recruits for World War I. So it created an inexpensive and objective way to separate those that could benefit from education or military leadership training and those who needed assistance. So if you scored really high in these intelligence tests, they're like, well, maybe you should be the one, doing the strategy. Maybe, these should be the officers. If you didn't score as high, well, now maybe you're more expendable and you might be one of the ones on the front lines, which they still kind of do today. When you go into the military, you still do take tests. And if you score high, you can uh, maybe become an officer or get like an analytics job type of thing. So there is some downside to IQ testing, right? Despite its utility, IQ testing had a big downside. Tests ended up reinforcing prevailing prejudices about race and gender, because certain people tended to score better than others, and and so it kind of reinforced these stereotypes we have. But a lot of that was because of opportunity. So ignored was the fact that environmental disadvantages limited the full development of people's intellectual abilities. All right, same problem we saw with NCLB, right? That was a No Child Left Behind that President Bush started in the early 2000s, which has since gone away. But that's what it was saying, is that everyone should be at the same um, place, and like 100% of the people should be passing the test. That's just not possible because some people have learning, disabilities, and not everyone has the same access to resources as everyone else does. Stereotype threat is a self-confirming concern that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype. So you see, these people, they're judged a certain way because they don't score as high in IQ testing. But once again, it's because maybe they weren't exposed to the same, resources, or there's other things going on. Where if you have to worry about just surviving, where's the next meal going to come from? You're not going to care about how well you're doing on an IQ test. And so that's the things that the IQ doesn't, in these testing, doesn't think of. So if you look at the map here, the yellow has the highest average IQ for the country, and so that's, you see that in Eastern Asia, so that's like China. The orange is the average IQ is 100, so that's Europe and Russia up here. The 85 to 90, which is still in the average range, so you see North and South America, North Africa, and Southwest Asia. So you got the Arabian Peninsula there and India. And then 70, average IQ 70, you see Sub-Saharan Africa. And then 60 is Australia, and then a part of South Africa. Australia is a little surprising, but if you're including the Aboriginal people there, that's probably why their IQ score is lower, because once again, that's not what they're focused on. The Aboriginal population of Australia is very poor and have a lot of issues, similar to like the Native Americans have, but even more. So if you think about the outback, there's a lot of, I mean, it would take a long time to explain all the issues they have. But once again, education probably is not, or at least our style of education isn't probably as important to them, and that's why they have lower IQ scores. So just a little bit about Alfred Binet, right? So he kind of comes up with this. He's from Paris in 1905 is when they kind of come up with this test, and what they're looking for is mental age. The goal of understanding intelligence was to predict how well children would do in school, and we mentioned that earlier. They're trying to help children, not label them. So Lewis Terman revised the age standards for children. So he takes the Binet-Simon test, and then he adjusts it. In his eyes, he makes it better, and he renames it. He renames it the Stanford Binet test, right? Because Terman was a professor at Stanford, so he names it after the university that he worked for. So the Stanford Binet test. So he revises the original Binet-Simon test. We talked about this a little bit earlier, the intelligence quotient, right? So William Stern derived the IQ from tests like the Stanford-Binet test. And to get this, you take your mental age, divide by your chronological age, and then you multiply it by 100, and that is your IQ score. And there are some free IQ scores you can take online. Um, I've had some. The one I used to send students, it was changed a little bit. I don't like it as much now, but that's a free one. That's like 41 questions. And so obviously the more questions you have, the more accurate it's probably going to be. But if you look around, you could probably find some free ones online. Just be careful of some are just kind of like scams, just like clickbait. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the extreme intelligence. So we're going to end part one of the notes talking about uh, the low part of the intelligence, and then part two we'll talk about the extreme, the high part of intelligence. So we talked about average intelligence is 85 to 115. So below average is 85 to 70. Anything below 70, you consider to have an intellectual disability. So the majority of people classified as intellectually disabled can live on their own with assistance, and they can contribute valuable skills to society, as we'll see, and we'll go through the different categories. So here are the four, the breakdown of the intellectual disability. So the four categories you have. So the mild intellectual disability, so your IQ is in the low 50s to 70s. So this is someone that may progress to about the sixth grade of academics. And this is most of the people with an intellectual disability. So obviously they're not going to have a high functioning job. But if you think about a sixth grader, a lot of times sixth graders, could take care of themselves maybe for a little bit. Maybe took care of some younger siblings. So you could survive, but your jobs are probably going to be more like labor type jobs. You have moderate intellectual disability. That is mid 30s to low 50s. You may progress to about the second grade academics. Severe intellectual disability, low 20s to mid 30s. So this is functions as a toddler, right? So think about a 2 to 3-year-old. These are people you can't really, leave alone. They won't be able to function on their own. Profound intellectual disability, these are people below 20 to 25, right? So they function as an infant. So if you think about an infant, someone who's 1 or younger, you literally can't leave them alone because they wouldn't be able to control themselves or take care of themselves and wouldn't be able to survive. So the last slide for intelligence part one is just that breakdown of the intellectual disability. So this is a chart from a textbook. So you see the mild, the 50 to 70 IQ. So this is about 85% of people have this. So if you notice, this is from one of the older textbooks. It says mental retardation. That was the official term until actually pretty recently. So the old textbooks, actually that's what it says in there. So 85% of people have a mild intellectual disability. So adaptation to demands of life, right? So they may learn academic skills up to sixth grade level. Adults may, with assistance, achieve self-supporting social and vocational skills. So they can still be a productive part of society. And that is the goal, right? That should be the goal of all citizens, all people, is to be a productive part of society. Moderate IQ is 35 to 49 percentage. About 10% of people with intellectual disabilities have this. They may progress to a second grade level academically. Adults may contribute to their own support by laboring in shelter workshops. So they have these things called shelter workshops where they do very simple works. I have a friend whose brother has Down syndrome, and I remember her saying that he worked in like these shelter workshops where they put together these simple maybe baskets, or some schools have programs where they have the functional students working in different workshops, where they actually work. They're teaching them the skills that they're going to need to survive when they get out, because you can only be in school to a certain age. And so this one they were making, I think it was like Valentine's Day cards at the time when I saw them. But a lot of times, when you're still in school, they do these jobs. They actually get paid for them, like maybe cleaning up the cafeteria and stuff like that, because that's what they're going to have to do when they get out of school, because that's the only type of job they can have. But once again, at least they are contributing to society, and that's the goal. Severe IQ around 20 to 34. This is only about 3 to 4% of people with intellectual disabilities. They may learn to talk and perform simple work tasks under close supervision, but are generally unable to profit from any vocational training. And then lastly, we have profound intellectual disabilities, and this is anything below 20 or low 20s. This is only 1 to 2% of the people with intellectual disabilities, and these are the people that require constant aid and supervision.